Hi, everybody. I am thrilled again to host the second of our 5-part Becoming Trauma Attuned series with CTARI Institute. I know that last week's with Dr. Broussard was so well received. Much more, I mean, the comments were incredible, how outstanding, and can't wait for the next. It was so valuable, more than I had ever hoped. So again, I'm so pleased to today introduce the another of CTARI's trainers. Actually, Frank Bacone is the Chief Training Officer for the CTARI Institute, and he will be presenting this morning on the effects of trauma on the brain. Amazing to me. Frank, I've been reading many studies that have demonstrated over and over that childhood abuse and neglect results in permanent changes to the developing human brain, which is astonishing to me. And they appear to be significant enough to potentially cause psychological and emotional problems that most of us had not understood. Most of us still don't understand. So I'm hoping, Frank, and I thank you in advance, to give us more insight on it, to help us understand it more. So again, Frank Bacone, Chief Training Officer, CTARI Institute, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Barb. Thank you for all that you do with Prevention is Key to organize and mobilize and disseminate this information, I think, which is crucial. Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to be here and talking about this. You know, I had met a gentleman, one of the parents of the Sandy Hook children. He lost his child in that catastrophe, and he had talked about the brain and mental health, and he said he was on a quest to change mental health to brain health, to talk about it as brain health, just basically because of the stigma of mental. And I really like that concept. And I think that one of the reasons why it's really important to understand how trauma, chronic stress, toxic stress, and I'll be talking about those three things shortly, why it's important to understand how it affects the brain is to kind of destigmatize brain health as something that is willful, when in fact there's a lot of chemical things going on in the brain that if I were to inject you with the hormones that go around your brain when you're stressed out, you would feel and act a certain way that you would really not have virtually any control over. So I think that the more we understand about how trauma affects the brain, the less we will look at it as a willful choice, and more of a battling of a medical issue. So with that, I'm gonna move on to stress. One of the things that I do a lot of work, and CTARI does a lot of work in schools and residential facilities and with the community on educating about stress. Our goal is not to eliminate stress, because some stress is positive. And when you have positive stress, like I'm about to do this talk, my heart rate is a little bit elevated. Some stress hormones become elevated, but it's healthy. It gets me on my toes. It gets me sharp. It gets me ready to be my best. Athletes before a game, or anyone in a competitive spirit will have a little bit of stress. And this is positive stress. It's not, there's nothing detrimental about it. It actually can be assisted. Then there's tolerable stress, where you're it's pretty significant, serious, but it's temporary responses, but it's a stressful situation, but it's buffered by supportive relationships, caring people that are there for you, and your own coping mechanisms are adequately managing it. But then there's toxic stress, the kind that we're going to be talking about today, the kind that Barb alluded to in the ACE study, when there's adverse childhood experiences, or a sexual or physical assault, and we'll talk about that. When there's something of a prolonged nature, where the stress continues to tax the response systems and there's not enough protective relationships to buffer it. There's not enough coping mechanisms. People ask all the time, they ask, why do some people have horrific events and they seem to be relatively unscathed, and some people have a couple of bad things happen and they're overwhelmed? And it really comes down to resilience. Resilience is a concept that's talked about a lot, and resilience is your supportive network of family, friends, and professionals that are around you to support you, but also your coping mechanisms, your stress management techniques. So we're going to talk a lot about all of that, but mostly we're not saying that we're trying to live stress-free lives. We're trying to live with positive stress and tolerable stress, but it's the toxic stress that we have to become very careful about. So toxic stress, chronic stress, trauma all have one thing in common. It's that the event or the series of events overwhelm your coping mechanisms and your protective factors. And so I'm going to use chronic stress to use I'm really referring to toxic and trauma. And it's being attuned to it, which means that we're going to mitigate the negative effects of it. We're going to try to grow from it and become even stronger and more resilient as a result of the events and experiences. Starts with recognizing how chronic stress affects the brain. So I'm going to show a little bit of a video here, and I'm going to ask you to pay particular attention to what functioning in the brain. You could pay attention to the brain parts too, but what happens when stress rises in us? What are the functions that we have less access to, the things that we're less capable of doing? That's the important part of this.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors. which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news, though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
So there's a lot to take away from that video. The parts of the brain, when the cortisol rises inside our bodies, when we're stressed over a long period of time, our ability to concentrate is diminished. Decision-making is impaired. Judgment is diminished. Social interaction, my social skills are not as sharp as they might be. My ability to learn and remember is impaired. So all of these functionings go up when cortisol levels stay in the brain for a long period of time. Many of our students are coming to school with high cortisol levels. Many of our teachers are coming with high cortisol levels. A good number of you watching this right now have high cortisol levels going on because of normal everyday stress that is continuous. And I really want to make that point in a second, but there's a couple of other things from that video. They talked about the epigenetic changes, and I know that Dr. Broussard last week talked about kind of inheriting stress. And I think she might have mentioned that Holocaust children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren might have epigenetic messaging that puts them at, they're experiencing some of the stress of their ancestors that was passed on genetically. And the same with the generations of ancestors of slaves and that sort of horrific ongoing stress. I also want to make an important point that while, as Barb mentioned, that there is brain changes, physiological changes in the brain when you're chronically stressed over a period of time. The brain is an unbelievably elastic organ, and there can be recovery and there can be a repair of the brain. But it really requires a lot of work and a lot of coping mechanisms and those protective factors. So I want to make a distinction because all the stuff, the brain shrinking, the amygdala getting bigger and more active, and the hippocampus kind of it being impaired, all those key biological factors are when stress is continuous and you don't have coping mechanisms or protective factors. For example, you have a fire in your home, you're assaulted, there's a bombing in the school, God forbid, there's like, you're in a car accident. These single event type of episodes, the cortisol rises, and then what ends up happening is that the event is over, supportive people come in, you experience calm, and the cortisol drops. Human beings do very well when they deal with events that have breaks in them where you're not continuously at those high cortisol levels. So we do well with intermittent events. We can manage them. It's the chronic stress, the stress where the cortisol levels stay at high levels. We call that in the clinical field complex trauma or chronic stress. Imagine situations where your cortisol level stays high for weeks, months, or years would be extensive child physical or sexual abuse. If you're living in a very dangerous neighborhood with a lot of crime and violence, every day that you live in that neighborhood and there's a potential for you to be a victim, or you hear about victims, or you come out of your house vigilant and watching, that stress never reduces. So you're living with high levels of cortisol. So your amygdala is more activated. So other parts of your brain that you are required to be functioning aren't functioning at their tip-top level. Obviously, a situation where there's domestic violence, the person being abused is stressed out during the abuse, stressed out before the abuse, anticipating it, stressed out after, remembering it. And so that's how we perpetuate the high levels of cortisol, because the events are so stressful and unpredictable. And we're in a pandemic right now, which is a chronic stressor. Every day you're inundated with information on the news. Every day you hear about people dying, people suffering, new mutant strains, or even something as basic that many of us have experienced when you're caring for a sick family member. You're stressed when you're with them, worried about them. You're stressed when you're away from them, thinking about them. You're stressed when you're going to see them, anticipating them. Living in poverty, being bullied for an extensive period of time. Racism for many people of color in our country and around the world, they can particularly be vulnerable to discrimination and violence based on the color of their skin. And so their world is a more stressful world because they are persecuted more. So these are all examples of complex trauma and high levels of cortisol. And the name of the game is, how do we learn to regulate our emotions to keep the cortisol down? So I'm going to go through now some of the more common manifestations. What happens in our brain? How does it manifest in the way we process the world? One example is dissociation, which I bet everyone here is familiar with. Dissociation is when you are, like, for example, have you ever driven somewhere and you're driving and then you get to the destination and you're literally surprised to see the destination? And that's because your mind and your body made a deal. Your mind said, I'm going to go think about this thing that I'm really worried about, or really anticipating, or it's a real problem. I'm going to think about it. Body, you're on automatic pilot, and you just get me to the destination. Make the lefts, make the rights, stop at the lights, do all the right things, but we're going to separate. Dissociation is a common symptom and behavior and manifestation of chronic stress. Your mind is so busy either focusing on trying to avoid the memory, the flashback, or your mind is focusing on trying to, or reliving the experience. Your mind and body separate. Many children in schools look like they have ADHD or they have focusing problems, when in fact they're dissociating constantly because there's a lot of arguing and fighting in the family, or there's drug use in the family, or there's abuse in the family. So that's dissociation. Fight, flight, or freeze are the three things. I'm sure Deb talked about them. Is what our bodies were designed from an evolutionary point of view. When the cortisol rises, you're ready to fight, you're stronger, your skin's tougher, your blood flows slower. So if you bleed out slower, you're stronger, you're faster. So if you have to fight a foe from way back when we were, surviving out there in the wilderness, you would have the strength to survive, or the strength to run away from a much more dangerous predator. Or freezing, which is also something that you see in the animal kingdom, where the predator comes upon the prey and the prey freezes. It's a freeze response. These are the common responses of human beings as well when cortisol rises and chronic stress or traumatic stress begins to overwhelm you. A narrow window of tolerance simply means you have very little patience for any stress. You see stress as overwhelming. It's almost like if your ultimate peak stress level is 10, you're walking around at a 9. It doesn't take much to set you off. Children, especially, who seem to get very upset very quickly, have very, very narrow windows of tolerance. And one of the goals of treatment is to get them to expand their tolerance so they can handle more stimuli that's stressful. Emotional dysregulation is I don't have a thermostat. I don't have a thermostat on my emotions. This is, you'll find people get upset and stay upset for extended periods of time. They get set off quickly. They don't have an ability to take down the highs and bring up the lows. So they're on a roller coaster emotionally. Flashbacks are important to recognize that they're not memories of a traumatic episode, but literally re-experiencing the episode. This is what's so traumatic about trauma, is that if you've been physically abused or sexually abused, for example, when you are, let's say the abuser smelled a certain way, had a certain cologne or perfume. When you smell that perfume, your body immediately brings you back, that olfactory senses bring you back to that episode, and you feel the sensations, you feel the shame or the terror, you are re-experiencing the event. And it's so devastating that people with significant trauma and chronic stress don't get a chance to really live in the present world because they're always possibly being hurled back into re-experiencing the bad event. Hyperarousal is kind of like I think of the deer or the whatever the prey of the elk or those animals that are out on the Serengeti that are just eating grass, but they're constantly looking around for where the predators are. You know, one of the quotes that you'll see in this presentation is that when we are traumatized, the brain moves from connection to protection. Everybody is a potential danger. Everyone could be a harrowing experience. So you're always on alert and always misassessing the environment as dangerous, which is much safer to do than assessing it as safe and being wrong. Numbing and long-term emotional blunting are examples of how physiologically we stop feeling. If you've ever met somebody or a child, it scares me when I see children like this, that they don't have any emotion on their face. It's a flat affect. And where you see an 8 or 9-year-old with flat affect, they're not even letting their bodies, manifest an emotion. They're suppressing it so much. And I once asked a teacher about a child I saw with a flat affect, and she explained to me, he explodes into violent rages and attacks the teachers at a moment's notice because there's so much repression. And long-term blunting is the same thing. So these don't all come at once for everybody. Different people experience different combinations of these, but you can see how debilitating this is because the brain chemistry is causing you to be on alert all the time. Being on alert all the time means certain functions of the brain get diminished, and those diminished functions lead you to have these manifestations. And they can happen, like I said, in all kinds of different ways. I want to just go through this example really quickly because I think these sets of slides really explain it. And I'll give an example from school. So the brain usually works like this. And the example is, let's say Frank is a teenager, let's say a 13-year-old in school, and they're having free time with the computer. So Frank did really well. So he gets 15 minutes of free time on the computer, but Frank has to go to the restroom. So Frank says to the teacher, I'm going to the restroom, but I don't want anybody taking my chair and I don't want to lose any of my 15 minutes. And the teacher says, don't worry, I'll take care of that. Okay. So Frank comes back into the class 10 minutes later, and his best friend, Matt, is in the chair at the computer working and having fun playing a game. And the teacher is gone, and there's another teacher there that is covering the classroom. And so Frank comes in, and the normal brain observes something's wrong here. Let me look around. Here's some input. The input is that somebody's at my darn desk, and it's really making me angry. And what happened to that teacher? Let me figure this out. Let me interpret. I think I got screwed here. Let me process this a little bit and maybe investigate. And when I go to the substitute teacher, she says, oh no, the teacher told me that you get your time. So Matt's going to get off there and you get back on there. And you're still kind of angry, but you evaluate your options and say, listen, I can throw a fit, but I'm getting back on. The reason the teacher did not betray me, she just had to go out for a second. My plan is to go sit in my chair, and my plan is to tell Matt, get lost and work. But what happens in the traumatized brain? If that child has a lot of trauma, they come back into the class and they observe immediately that they've been lied to. They've been betrayed, because they've been lied to and betrayed a lot in their life. And they get really, really angry really quickly, and they interpret the event very quickly. My teacher lied. Matt, who was my friend, stole my seat. I've lost my free time. Working all that time to own that didn't matter to anything. And then they begin to react violently and go up and attack Matt and drag him out of the chair and get into a fight with him. And they're restrained, and they're brought down to the principal, and they don't have ability to regulate their emotions, and they continue to curse and scream. And everybody goes, what is wrong with this kid? You see, what happens in the brain is, with all those high levels of cortisol, we don't thoroughly think things out. We immediately go to the worst case scenario. And if this keeps happening, that shortcut past processing, evaluating options, planning, and acting becomes a highway. And that highway in the brain becomes a constantly overreacting or misassessing your environment as the worst possible environment, because the high levels of cortisol got you on high alert. And when, let's say, teachers say something mean, like, why did you have to attack Matt? Or you have to learn to calm down, or power struggles, or you get isolated and you start feeling hopeless, or you feel rejected. We're just making the alarm system validate that it was right. So what this whole experience is about is attunement. How do we bring ourselves into harmony and become more effective at responding to all of these ways that the traumatized person, the traumatized child or adult, is misunderstanding the environment as dangerous, misunderstanding people as dangerous, and moving from seeking connection to people to seeking protection from people. And so I want to show you a little bit of a vision for what schools are doing to be more trauma attuned, to look at each child's experiences and factor in how they need to work with them and teach them and create sense of safety. And that's what this little video is about.
What does it mean to make the world a better place?
Nice. So those are those big questions we're focusing on. For me, being trauma informed has so much to do with mindset, accepting that different people come into a school setting with incredibly varied life experiences. Some of those life experiences may be traumatic, and the way in which that plays out in my particular classroom could look a number of ways. And by me having that lens, it makes it less about are they doing the right thing or the wrong thing, and more about where is that behavior coming from? Why is that happening?
Adverse childhood experiences like poverty, neglect, exposure to violence can bring about overwhelming stress, which can cause negative effects on the learning brain and on behavior. If children have the experience of adversity, they will have uneven development of these foundational skills like self-regulation and executive function or relationship skills. These are the children who are at risk to fall further and further behind. But the good news is that there is a powerful antidote to stress, and that is the effect of the human relationship and the presence of trust. Schools are an ideal place to produce many different kinds of relationships that are capable of buffering stress. Schools themselves can be healing places.
If you're fearful, if you're anxious, if you're distracted about something that's happened to you, you literally can't learn. Your brain shuts down. So it's essential to give kids social and emotional tools that allow students to recover from the challenges that they have experienced. Take actual classroom time to work on the building blocks of how to perceive your emotions, how to talk about them, how to get along with other people, how to take a moment and become calm when you need to, how to express your needs so that others can meet them.
When we start to understand what it takes to be responsive to the effects of trauma, we need to think about the environment, about individual services, and we need to think about the skills and mindsets of kids that won't develop as they should when they're impacted by trauma.
I do a lot of work around self-awareness and being able to name emotions and then make a choice around those.
When I get mad, I take deep breaths, and that helps me get more calm.
Many of the things that we think about doing for kids who may have experienced trauma are good for everybody. And everyone will encounter some kind of adverse circumstance at some point in their life. And for some children, we're helping them deal with what's already happened in their lives. For others, we're preparing them to deal with the challenges later in their lives.
If you can hear my voice, say, we are awesome.
Before I get into this slide, I just love the idea that being trauma informed or trauma attuned means I'm going to pay attention to my body language, and I'm not going to move about quickly. I'm going to pay attention to the way I speak, because I don't want to do anything that might trigger a child with trauma. I want to be trauma attuned. I want to be trauma informed. I want to teach them to identify emotions, to manage emotions. I want to model for them when the teacher gets stressed that I'm going to stop, recognize my stress when it's at manageable levels, and I want to breathe through it. I want to calmly breathe through it. And we can create these kinds of environments in schools. We can create these kinds of environments in workplaces for adults. We can create these kinds of environments in treatment programs and mental health programs, brain health programs. But it involves us understanding that we're dealing with biology, we're dealing with behaviors that are manifested from that biology, and we're dealing with ways that we trigger those behaviors and ways we use punitive approaches to those behaviors. Rather, it's kind of being punitive to a diabetic because their blood sugar rises and they're becoming their behavior is changing. We have to recognize that we have to understand. And this slide here highlights the mindset shift that comes with becoming trauma attuned. Instead of what's going on with these kids and how can I control their behavior, what we want to move to is, what am I feeling and thinking? What zone am I in? Am I in a comfortable zone as an adult? What do I need to do to get myself closer to the green zone? So instead of focusing on controlling children, we should focus on us adults controlling ourselves and keeping ourselves well regulated so we don't lose the functioning of our executive functioning and we don't become less able to attune to their needs. This student is not listening. If I don't control him, I will lose the others. Instead of looking at that and going to that, catastrophic, I'll lose control of everyone. It should be, this student is struggling to reset themselves, to manage their emotions. I will focus on those still cooperating and energize them while I find a way to help this child regulate their emotions. Instead of, I must get through this lesson, educators have to focus on, I must help all students regulate their emotions to optimize their ability to learn. I have successfully seen many schools moving from bell to bell teaching to teachers recognizing when their class becomes dysregulated or a certain number of kids become dysregulated and having brain breaks. breaks to get them better regulated so that when the material, the educational material comes next, it will be digested by a brain that's receptive and not one that's on high alert and not able to learn. And for teachers, I must not be a good teacher because a lot of my class continues to behave badly. What we need to do is again focus on, I am being my best when I'm aware of my emotional state and I regulate that state to optimize my ability to assess what's going on in the class and respond effectively to my students' needs. And obviously the classic move from being not trauma attuned to trauma attuned is not looking at kids' behavior as what's wrong with this kid, but what has happened in this child's life for this behavior to make sense. I love this quote from Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, and I think it really sums up the general way to cope with managing stress effectively. And it's between stimulus and response, there's a space. Between that example I gave, between that child walking into the classroom and immediately assessing that he's been betrayed by the teacher and his friend Matt is really betraying him as well, to stop and breathe and let the cortisol level drop a little bit. Let the cortisol level drop and your brain will come into better focus and you'll be able to say, wait a minute, this may not be that worst case scenario. So in that space, that pausing space, pause is a wonderful strategy to allow cortisol to dissipate in our body so that we can regain our critical thinking skills. Because our response will be so much better if we pause and don't make it an amygdala-driven response. And our growth and freedom in this world and our ability to make the good decisions that don't keep us in a stressful situation depends on our ability to keep our brain state in the best possible shape, and pausing before reacting helps us to respond. And in that vein, I wanted to do one of the things with all of you, since I don't know, maybe some of this is stressing you out, or the person doing construction with a saw outside my window is stressing me out right now. Maybe we can all just relax and do this 1 minute meditation together to get our cortisol levels as low as we can in this moment.
Close your eyes, and we'll take a few moments to calm your mind and body. Soften your face, your neck, and shoulders. Do your best to fully let go. And turn your attention to the breath, the calming breath, the soothing breath. Take long, slow breaths, full and deep. Breathing in, I am calm. Breathing out, I'm at peace.
And that concludes my presentation. I appreciate your watching, and I hope that this helps us to understand that our brain health is greatly impaired by long-term chronic stress events like trauma, like toxic stress, like the pandemic, like poverty, like all the things we talked about. And the key for us, I mean, Bessel van der Kolk has a quote that I think is really important. He says, the key to all trauma treatment is learning a way to relax your body, learning a way to calm your physical body, and your mind will follow. And then practicing that way when you begin to get stressed, and practicing and making it a habit so that we can constantly assess our state and realign it or reset it. That's the key, calming the body. So on that note, I'm going to come out and see if there are any questions that people have chatted in that I can answer, or clarify any of the points about how trauma affects the brain.
Thank you, Frank. So we do have one question. Is depression a form of chronic stress?
Well, I think that depression is also something that, I mean, you could become very sad at the loss of somebody, and you could become kind of situationally depressed, which is an understandable experience of the person dealing with loss and focusing on that loss and needing some time to grieve and hurt. Clinical depression is something that can be biologically driven. It could be that you are clinically depressed no matter what situation is going on, even if things are going well. And that is like the trauma we're talking about. That is biologically driven. There are chemicals that are in your body that are being suppressed and being expressed that cause that depression. So I think depression is could be situational, but clinical depression is something that is dangerous in that there could be situations that are exacerbating the depression, but ultimately there might be medical interventions to help with some of the chemical issues that might be going on that are causing you the suffering and potentially self-harming or suicidal ideations.
Great, thank you. The next question is, a teen who is in a residential treatment program, how do we help them with trauma they feel about being there along with their own issues, such as substance use disorder or sexual trauma?
I think that's a fantastic question. And I've got 30 years of experience as a clinician, as a clinical supervisor, and as an executive director of large residentials in New Jersey. And I can tell you that the number one thing is to teach and train your staff to recognize, to do all the stuff that we train when you become trauma attuned. The first thing is to understand how childhood trauma affects kids. The second thing is to understand that there's trauma in you, the staff, that will be triggered. And you yourself have to be a master at regulating your emotions. And then the third thing is, what are the ways, once you understand what stress does to people and how it how they use all these protective coping mechanisms that you don't take their behavior personally. It is biologically driven, and they're trying to cope in the best way they can. I learned that the problem in a residential is most of the time that they're in the residential, they're with very young and a very underpaid direct care staff. And in those moments, we have to train that staff to be much more attuned to stress, much more counter-aggressive. We must have a non-punitive environment, and they could benefit tremendously from all the training on being trauma attuned. And I think the clinical work has to be the clinicians helping the direct care staff to be more attuned, to be careful of the ways they trigger the behavior of kids, be careful of the ways they respond to some of the disturbing behavior, and also to give the staff self-care strategies to take care of themselves, because they're under tremendous stress and likely to become traumatized themselves in the residential treatment center. And to keep the kids connected to any family or community connections, because those are protective factors. I could go on, but I think it's a real challenge because there are so many other traumatized youth there. Even if it's a 5-bed residential program, there's 5 individuals with varied levels of trauma, all manifesting their behaviors and potentially triggering each other's trauma. So I give tremendous credit to residentials for the challenge of creating a treatment environment when there's so many behaviors that could trigger each other.
Great. Thank you. And I think that's a great follow-up question. Someone else asked, do you have any recommendations for teachers to be trauma attuned in a virtual space?
I think that we've got to, that's a great question. I think what we've got to focus on in the virtual world is that we're losing so many physical cues that we can get in the real world. we've got to have connection. We've got to talk to the kids about how they're feeling. We've got to do more to get them personally invested in the Zoom or Google Meet or whatever you're using. We can't just be academically oriented. A lot of teachers are playing a lot of games, starting with a check-in. There has to be more personal connection to the kids. And there has to be much more interaction and engaged activities. You have to make up for the lack of the human connection in being alive. And there's a lot more, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Next question, how to move from a self-pity, woeful mindset, meaning not ready to change, hopelessness, to taking action and changing?
For the, is that for the person with trauma or for the person working with the trauma?
Good question.
I mean, maybe it's both. If it's the person with the trauma, doing education with the individual about the effects of trauma will take some of the stigma out of it and let them know that the battle plan is practicing calming your body, and not practicing it at the peak of an episode, but practicing it when mild stress hits. You can't learn a skill when you're asked to learn it in the most intense experience that could happen. We've got to become, we really have to focus on the ability to calm the physical body down. Remember, the cortisol release comes before the brain. Remember I said that the child smells the cologne or the perfume of the abuser? And if you were to talk to that child at that moment, they would not be able to cognitively say, I think I'm having memories of the abuse I experienced based on the smell. The smell, the body responds like they're back in the moment. So it's education so that we can tell them, you're not a bad person, you're not a broken person. You're a person whose brain has been rewired by experiences, and your brain is going to take a backseat to your body. So meditation, yoga, physical progressive relaxation, breathing videos like the one I showed. We've got to make those crucial. And when we do that, they'll have a more hopeful outlook on how they have to attack and cope. But they'll have techniques, they'll have skills. You need to help in order to feel hopeful that you're going to get over something or get through something. You need strategies, and the strategies have to start with emotional regulation and small successes at minimizing or mitigating escalating feeling. That's where hopefulness starts.
Great, thank you. Next question, does the body ever repair from chronic stress, especially long-term stress?
Yes, yes, it does. The thing that the literature that I've been reading lately about post-trauma resilience is that most of the benefits of being stressed and working your way through it is that you're better prepared for the future stress in your life. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but a lot of what I'm seeing in schools and high schools, in certain high schools, are kids that just aren't prepared for the real world. And I'm talking about high schools in more affluent communities. They don't have practice with adversity. They don't have practice with stress. See, the kids that have been through a lot of trauma have something that those kids don't have. They have experience. And if we can help them negotiate it and grow from it, they can be stronger because they had these challenging experiences. There is a lot of research out there on post-trauma resilience. And I think that the brain, we barely understand it, but it has an elasticity, especially in youth, to be able to develop neural pathways. And you could develop neural pathways that make a shortcut to a very bad response, or you can start developing neural pathways to short circuit that are about healthier responses like breathing and managing your emotions. I think there's tremendous hope. It's not a life sentence. It's just what you've been through. And when you can put it in the past, that's when healing begins. But when it keeps coming and visiting you in full, vibrant color and experience, that's when it continues to be damaging.
Right, right. Thank you, Frank. I want to be mindful of your time, Frank. I know you have another commitment at 12. So if we don't get through all the questions, everyone, Frank will be able to answer them, and we'll send them out, through an email. So I don't know if we want to answer one more, and then the following questions we'll definitely make sure that we follow up, and Frank will send an answer to those who didn't get an answer to their questions. So next question is, how does chronic pain affect trauma?
Chronic pain is chronic stress. People who have pain every day are having chronic stress. The cortisol levels are rising as their pain is unmitigated and they continue to struggle. So I believe that the best thing that you can do, if you can't find any sort of pain management that's healthy and appropriate, is to try to learn various ways to relax your body, because the stress is sending signals to your brain that you're in danger, and it's adding on to the unmanageable physical pain. So I think that if you're in chronic pain, you're potentially suffering from chronic stress. And I think that chronic stress is most effectively managed by learning to relax at every part of the body, meditation, mindfulness, all of the techniques to slow everything down and stay in the present moment and not to move to the future or move back to the past. But I feel for people with chronic pain, because all of us know what intermittent pain is like, but when the pain is there every day, you really have to develop a mindset of how to minimize it to just the physical pain and not torture yourself with the psychological pain of it. And that's not easy. I think chronic pain is such a present stressor, and I feel for people with it, but I think it is exacerbated by the stress that we manufacture over just lamenting about it and focusing on it, instead of trying to figure out ways to relax the body and relax the tension in the body, and still have the pain, but not have the excessive stress that goes with it.
Right. Well, thank you, Frank. So again, we'll follow up on these questions, Frank. I'll send them over to you,
Yes,
and we'll be sure to send them out. So I'm going to hand it back over to Barb Kaufman.
Yes, please. I'm anxious, Frank, to tell you how great it was. I get afraid that, I'm going to get bored just hearing about the brain, but it is so interesting. And to tell you too that many of the chats have said how interesting, how valuable, and how needed something like this is to make us, again, it's all understanding, to understand it more. So I thank you again. Now, the third of our series, I think we're back to Dr. Rassard, right? Next
Yes.
week, about trauma
Talking
and kids.
specifically, I think, about children, right?
Yeah, so that will be Dr. Rassard. Again, I hope all of you will join us. The PowerPoint and the recording will be sent to each of us, all the attendees. So I hope everybody loved it as much as I did. You were outstanding, I promise. So I will talk to you soon. I hope everyone knows about our ACEs work group meeting tomorrow. And Frank, I will see you there, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Frank.
Ash?
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you before I get off. Thank you so much. I think it was great, don't you?
Yeah, that was great. I love it. Yeah.
CTARI is amazing. They're amazing. I'm so glad that I hooked up with them. Okay, Ann, talk to you later.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Yeah.